Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matt Pierce. I am the Learning and Video Ambassador for TechSmith, and I am your weekly guide here as we go through the world of video and images, learning, development, customer education, technical documentation, and so much more. Glad to have you here watching with us today. We got a great guest coming up. His name is Mike Taylor. If you don't know Mike, you're going to want to know Mike because he is a wealth of information, and I know he loves sharing it. And of course, as we get started here, a couple things we'd like to talk about first. I do always like to mention the TechSmith Academy is our free online learning platform. You can find it there. If you just search for TechSmith Academy, it will come up. And big news, guys, this week we launched a new course. It is Basics of Screen Recording. It is 30 videos, and I know that sounds like a lot. It's about an hour's worth of content. It's going to walk you start to finish through the process of creating great screen recordings. It's not a Camtasia course. I want to be very clear. This is about the process of things that you should do to get good results. Now, of course, I talk a little bit about Camtasia because that's the tool I use. However, the principles will apply to any tool that you're using with screen recording. Go check it out. Again, it's completely free. Go to bit.ly/TechSmith Academy or just search for TechSmith Academy. You'll find us out there for sure. So, as we get going here, a couple things I want to say before I introduce Mike to us all. Mike is, as I said before, Mike is someone you want to know. He's super knowledgeable. I mean, he's got over, I think he said 2 decades of industry experience with training and development. So he's been around. He's seen lots of trends. He knows that's not always the thing you want to follow. But he's also been a community manager with Articulate, the e-learning heroes community. So he's seen a lot of great things there, what it means to be in a community. And if you want to learn something, you need to follow Mike because Mike is a super sharer. I don't know how he does it all. Like literally, he shares so much great information that go follow him. You can find him at his website, mike-taylor.org, and we'll make sure we get that posted so you guys can find it. Should be in the descriptions already. So with that said, Mike, welcome to the Visual Lounge today.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me. Super excited to have a chat today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Mike, I said a few things about you, but why don't you go ahead for our audience and just introduce yourself?
Yeah, I don't know that I can do any better than what you've done. I'm going to pay you to just follow me around to places and give that introduction. So
I'll be your hype man.
We'll talk money afterwards. Yeah, exactly. No, I think you captured it. I sometimes feel, and maybe you've had this feeling too, love what I do, and sometimes, right, it's working in a job that you enjoy is worth a lot, and so just the whole process of learning energizes me, and I love to. I'm also kind of maybe lazy, it's maybe lazy, or it's a fine line between lazy and efficient, right? Like finding better ways to do your work, and one of my worst dreaded, most hated things is manual stuff, upload, download, all the manual stuff, and just ways to sort of improve your workflow and scale learning and all that sort of stuff. So at heart, I'm just a big sort of learning nerd, I think probably sums it up best.
Which is not a bad thing, right? I think that's where I fall, although I probably don't learn nearly as much as my colleagues, but I think it's a good trait to always be learning and always trying to figure out how to do those things. For you, Mike, today's topic, we want to talk about designing for learning, because there's so many things you could potentially do, and this is a huge topic. But for you, are there base fundamentals? Like if you're going to go in and build a course for somebody or design some learning for someone, I know there's the basic stuff where you'd start, you could do the ADDIE model or whatever, but really at the end of the day, what's the key for you to start designing something that's going to actually help someone learn?
Well, I think for me, the two biggest things for me personally, everything sort of builds off these two things, and it's curiosity and empathy, right? So empathy with, okay, well, what are the people that we're speaking to, or what are the people that we're trying to help? What is their day like? What are they dealing with? What are they, what's their environment like? Put yourself in those shoes. What windows of time do they have available to be maybe away from their productive work? Try to just take a snapshot as best as you can of what's their world like, and then because I think that's something that gets missed, more often than it probably should. And then the other thing is curiosity, right? I see some people sort of fall into the default, well, it's training and we're just going to do training. We're the training department. And you sort of get stuck in the whole problem of, I've got a hammer, everything looks like a nail sort of thing. And if you keep those two things together, curiosity, well, is that really the right way? Or what if we did this? Or what are the other opportunities right before the train leaves the station and you're going down a path that may not be the right one? And so I think at the heart of everything that I try to do is those two things, empathy and curiosity, and then build from there.
Well, I love that because I know oftentimes I'll talk about making videos and I talk about like, oh, know your audience. And I feel like perhaps that as like people that make training that's not their first thought, right? Like because maybe we take it for granted. I kind of know my audience, right? Like maybe they work inside my organization. But I feel like marketers or product development teams, they have to work really hard to know their audience, and it really matters. So I'm wondering, and I want to make sure we get to the curiosity stuff too, but I'm wondering, what has helped you to build empathy for the people that you're designing learning for? Is there something that you do or something that's helped you to make that connection with your audiences beyond just saying like, I'm going to go out and do like a survey? Maybe that's it though.
Well, so it's not always possible. I'm going to come back to the marketing thing, just so I want to kind of stick a pin in that. But if it's possible, so I'll give you an example. So for a long time, I used to work at a power company, so electric company that, big coal-fired power plants that you've probably driven by. And a lot of the training that got pushed out was from, corporate office in a big city with, big, fast connections. And people would build these courses, and they'd be fine courses, but they would be these really high bandwidth, really rich multimedia stuff. And those people, they've never been to an actual power plant, which are typically out in the middle of nowhere, like literally nowhere. And there might be an entire power plant that's sharing a single 64K connection for everyone. And when you try to run that media rich stuff, it just doesn't flat out doesn't work. And so, if it's possible, right, just going to the places where your people are going to be is such a huge, huge benefit. You go in a power plant, and depending on where you're at, it may be insanely loud and you can't hear anything. So, just understanding, putting yourself in those shoes, what's the environment like, what are the people like, is invaluable if you can do it, right? And fortunately, if you go to one power plant you've probably been to, you get the gist of it. You don't have to go to every one. But getting to those places as much as possible is a huge benefit.
Right.
And kind of recognizing you can't always do that is just trying to build relationships and connect with actual people. So, maybe it's a phone call and they can help you, or just being open to feedback is another thing. One of the things I've always tried to do is never put anything out that doesn't have some channel back.
Oh, yeah.
And if you do one of these big courses and there's some way for people to communicate back to tell you, hey, like this video won't even load, and here's why. I've talked to people who are reticent to enable that feedback, even just a simple form, like a comment form, leave it open-ended. My experience, it's been 99% positive. Hey, there's a typo on page 3, or, hey, this policy, did you know there's this gray area that's not really clear? And so 99% of the communications I get back have always been helpful and positive.
Yeah, so a couple things just to reiterate. I think I love that what you're saying. You got to get out with the people if you can, because I know I worked at a pharmaceutical, same kind of thing, right? Like a manufacturing plant, super noisy. In fact, there were some areas like you had to like suit up with like static lines so you're not going to blow things up, and like just all the things and the computers that they had. There's no way they're going in for a full multimedia experience, let alone, their work environment was, I think it was like 3 days on, 3 days off, 12 days, 12-hour shifts. And so and maybe they're the only person at the entire plant that could do their job. And so totally makes sense. And then, the feedback mechanism, I know it's hard to get that feedback, right? It's sometimes you don't want to hear you made a mistake or something didn't work, but yeah, it seems super, super valuable. And I want to just round back because you said you wanted to stick a pin in what I said about marketing. So what were your
Yeah.
thoughts about the marketing aspect of it?
Well, so marketers, I think, do a much better job of, they can't obviously visit everybody, but they collect tons of data, and they can see that, you're visiting on a mobile phone in Chrome browser, and right, like they can get all of these details technically, and then beyond that, they'll do focus groups, and even a step behind that even is building personas. So
Yeah.
here are some representations of the people that we're targeting, the people that we're trying to attract. And I think it does a little bit better at kind of humanizing than kind of typical training analysis, because it sort of recognizes like, hey, there's a human that we're really talking to. And sometimes I think it can get lost otherwise. And so I really like some of the tools and techniques that marketers use. And, I've talked about this a lot. If you think about training and marketers, right, we really have a couple of common challenges. We're both trying to get people's attention. And then hopefully once we've got that attention, then we're trying to help them think and do something in a different way. And I think if you, as a whole, put training versus marketing, you would see two pretty significantly different approaches.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been in conferences and look, I sit in marketing, so I really have no room to talk here about marketing. But the thing is, I at learning and development conferences, I can make the joke like, I work for marketing, the dark side, and that's really not fair. I think it's just like you said, those are different roles, but they're taking different approaches. But at the end of the day, we really have similar, like we want people to do things, right? Training is to get an outcome. We want people to change behavior, or we want them to impact the way they're doing something so it's more efficient, safer, or that they're aware and of like, oh, I have knowledge that this is not a good practice. Like I shouldn't do that. Well, that could be a marketing thing or a training thing, right? Like, so it's interesting. I think there's a lot to learn from the marketing side that you're right. And I think, again, like you said, empathy for those folks. And then as we trying to keep everything straight in my head, Mike. The other thing was empathy, and what did you say what the other thing was?
Curiosity.
Curiosity, yeah. We haven't talked about curiosity, but marketers are insanely curious too. And I'm not here to give props to marketers. They're not doing everything right either, but like it's such a valuable thing, right? Like, how do I do this? How do I figure this out? Could we try? What if we did something different? And I know I'm guilty of sometimes not being curious enough to go and learn about all the things that I could be doing, because it takes time. It's hard. So I don't think you have a secret recipe for building curiosity, do you?
No, I don't. Although like that's another thing that marketers are good at is, you've seen the titles, right? Like 6 great things to make you the most amazing cook, or like whatever, right? Like, well, what are those 6 things? Or they'll ask a question like, what's the secret to, the meaning of life, whatever. The headlines that marketers use, right? They spend a lot of time crafting those, and it's not an accident that those are the format that they are versus, hey, it's compliance 101, like it's pretty, nobody cares, it's boring, you're falling asleep before you even get there sort of stuff. But I think marketers understand that to capture attention and make things memorable, they've got to tap into some kind of emotion, whether it's curiosity or humor or whatever that is. There's a really great book that Stephen Pressfield has. He's a writer, and he says, streamline your message, pare it down to its essentials, and then make it funny, humorous, mysterious, like emotional. If you can do those 2 things, just do that to everything.
Yeah.
And everything will be better.
Yeah. I mean, what a great point, right? And I know, so I've got a colleague, Troy Stein. He talks about Made to Stick. If you've read that book by Dan and Chip Heath, right? Like and a lot of their stuff is like, you got to hook them in the beginning. You got to get them up front. And I think it sounds like that, and again, I'm speaking from my own experience, which is all I can really do, is that I forget that a lot, right? Like, and I know, so I was doing a webinar earlier today, and one of the comments from people was that their SMEs, or subject matter experts, want to include everything into a learning course, right? But while that's great. They want to share their knowledge and expertise, and they have a lot of it. But that doesn't work for learning. It doesn't work because you want to focus, right? Like keep narrowing this in so that we can just give them the right stuff at the right time. And I think it's hard to remember that when you're like, no, I want to make sure I'm doing enough or giving them everything they're ever going to need. It doesn't seem logical, I guess.
Well, and it reminds me of what we were talking about before we started, like with your son, right? Like if you would throw everything that involved with coding and setting up Minecraft servers and all that sort of stuff at once, you're like, oh, I guess too much. I can't even. I'm out of here. But if you can say, give them that hook up front, and it's amazing what people will do when they're hooked and motivated that way, intrinsically motivated, is they will go and they'll find it, right? Like they'll go to YouTube and search discussion forums and they'll figure it out, and it's amazing. When the resources are available, how much that somebody can do. And they may need an expert at certain points here and there, but they don't need, the 8-hour full day workshop version of that, right?
Right.
Like that'd be awful.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, Mike, and if we can speak to this, is that, I think, I'm trying to frame this question so it makes sense. I think, obviously there's lots of approaches you could take. And you mentioned that intrinsic motivation, right? Like I think my son learning to set up a Minecraft server or to learn to program in Scratch, totally internally motivated, right? He wanted to do it. It would be fun. I think about a lot of workplace topics, and I can say categorically, almost no one's going to say that topic is fun or motivating. So how do you design? I want to get back to let's talk about design a little bit. How do you start thinking about designing for those topics where everyone's like, I really don't want to do this?
Well, one thing is I think you can sort of admit to the fact, like, yeah, hey, I get it. This isn't fun, right? Like everybody knows we've got to do our expense reports, right? Nobody likes it, but I think everybody can respect like it's a necessary evil, right? And I think, one of the things that in a lot of the corporate stuff that I have seen is like, it's okay to have some personality, right? Like we got to do it. So why not? Let's make it a little bit fun and amusing or something, right? Like don't just make it like sleep inducing. So I think, put some personality into it. You can still do serious things and have some fun or some personality along the way. So I think that's one thing, is just like admit to it. Yeah, this sucks. Nobody likes expense reports, but you got to know how to do it or we're going to get in trouble. So I think that's one thing, is just, don't hide behind it. Don't run from it.
Yeah, I love that. Embrace it, right? Like, because everyone, I mean, expense reports is a great example. I can think of lots of compliance training that we could all mention. It's really unfortunate that you have to do that, but I love the idea. Just let's lean into it. I'm sure it gets a little trickier when it's more sensitive topics. You got to be careful. You don't want to cross any lines. You don't want to do anything offensive, but like expense reports are like, I do mine every month and I hate it every month.
But the other thing too is kind of to the point of not everything has to be training, right? Like, so if you can make the process better, a lot of times that's less expensive and less painful than all of the training you've got to do to go through all of the painful hoops and, unintuitive workflows and all that sort of stuff. These days, right? Like take a picture of your receipt, like Expensify or whatever app you're doing, and connect that to the place. Well, if the process is that easy, we need maybe a fraction of the training, right? Here's how you get started and here's where to get support, and, off you go and get back to work.
Yeah, and I almost wonder if, from thinking from a design perspective, right, if you were doing this and if it doesn't need to be a training, like this goes back to when I was in grad school and we talk about like systems, right? It's not everything is training. So is there something that's going to help them to be motivated to do it, right? Can you gamify this? Does it make sense to do that? And I'm not saying that's what you should do, but like looking at all the other potential solutions around that, I think a lot of people, training professionals or HR professionals, they could offer this. It just, do you have the motivation and time and wherewithal to want to do it? It seems like at the end of the day, because probably easy to make a video about here's how you fill out your expense report. A little bit harder to make it like feel like it's worthwhile, or give me the other pieces I might need to make it like understand its importance even.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I don't know. Are you familiar with Thomas Gilbert and his behavior engineering model at all?
I
It's
may have heard of it, but I couldn't talk about it at any length at
so
all.
it's really fantastic, and it really the essence of it is training is one factor that can impact performance, but we have all these other things like, do they have the right resources? Did we hire the right people? Do they have the right incentives, or are there disincentives? Like all of these things that go together to impact that. Training is one little corner piece over here, and normally it's training. Training is rarely by itself sufficient. It's usually some combination of that, maybe, and training. But to get out of that box and to take a bigger, more holistic view of what's happening. So, for example, back to the expense reports, if the company may save some amount of money by people turning their expense reports in early, okay, well, like you said, let's make a little competition out of it. So everybody who turns their expense reports in early, you're entered for some sort of nominal, I don't know, prize, whatever, gift card or whatever it is. And my guess is whatever we would give away in those prizes, we would more than save by getting people, so by incentivizing them to turn it in early. And A, or B rather, right, like just the awareness that, oh, we're saving money, so now, right, like maybe I never knew that before because nobody ever told me. So, just training itself can't do any of that kind of stuff.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, think outside the slide says, in this new online world, what are some options for getting real-time feedback during a session? Polls are a common approach, but what other options have you found successful? And I think this is a really good question, right? You're not just designing here's what you're going to learn, here's the information I'm going to convey, but how do you get that interaction to or from the learners, especially in this online world?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think we have to be a little more planful, right? Like choosing tools that enable it, obviously, right? Because if it's not there, it's impossible. But I think we've got to force ourselves to check in more often. So in a classroom, like you can see those faces that when people look like they're lost or have a question, or you can see on their face. And even in Zoom, right? If you have a lot of people, it's hard it's just not the same. You can't track that as easily. So, I think you've got to be more planful on having somebody help you is also another thing, right? Like if you're in these type of online things, like somebody who can watch the chat and watch the faces, right? Like a producer type person is, if it's a luxury, but it's really, I think, a really huge benefit. So that, and being more planful. I don't know that there's a magic app that solves all of that. If there is, I would love to hear what it is. But certainly, polling tools and, keeping people engaged and interacting, right? Like interaction of the type that's happening in their brain and not just clicking buttons type of interaction. So I think those are a couple of important things, but it's a constant challenge, and it's everybody's getting tons of practice now these days, right? So hopefully we're going to see a trend towards better.
Well, and I think it's about a little bit, for me, I think it feels like it's a little bit about being creative about those interactions and engagements. Like, and I love the world. I don't remember the exact word you said, but I loved it because it was like being purposeful, being thoughtful about it, being mindful that you're actually building that in. And it's so easy to just skip over, especially I think in online, because like, oh, I will never, like if it's a pre-recorded or, on demand, I'll never see their faces. It's not like, even like you said about Zoom, maybe I'll never see their faces. I'll never see their reactions. I'll never get real time in the moment feedback, but it seems like there are things you could do beyond just a poll. I think I love knowledge checks, not for the purpose of testing your knowledge, but for like, are you understanding? Because like you said, I think I could get that from your face. Like, they're very confused. Maybe I need to clarify. But at least a knowledge check, I can start to see like, oh my gosh, so many people are getting this wrong, and not blame them, but blame me. Like, oh, this is a crappy question. This information didn't really answer that question. And so is it the question that's bad, or is it that the knowledge didn't convey? And my experience on the Camtasia certification, we've seen this. We've had to go adjust questions because question and answers are Q, like doing that's hard, but I think it's another thought point to say like polls aren't the only thing. Get them to do projects, get them to do kind of other things as well, I think.
And that raises another point, right? Like I think as we're moving this direction, we're forced to move this direction, right? Like we shouldn't just be taking our classroom stuff and putting it online now without stopping to pause, because there are things like, polls and questions and assessment things that in some regards we can do easier online, right? Like it's easier to give a really quick poll to everybody here. It's easier online than it would be in a classroom, maybe. And so there's some affordances that we have, and I think just slamming everything online is a mistake.
Yeah.
And not taking the opportunity to say, okay, maybe there's some parts that we can do asynchronously before we come together or after or whatever, and reevaluating, what's that mix and what works in which place. And so I hope that's another thing that we see a trend in as we get more practice.
Yeah, for sure. So let's move on to our next question, Mike, from our audience. Laura asks, what evaluation method do you prefer most? Do you rely upon quantitative data? So as you're looking at the results, is there evaluation methods that you like to use when you're looking at how successful courses are, if it's working or not?
Yeah, so that's another one. I don't have any silver bullet to it, but I think it starting with what are your objectives, right? So if it's filling out expense reports, you would hopefully see that we have a metric that, incorrectly completed expense reports is trending down, or we have some performance outcome that we can point to and say, okay, this is making a difference, and then sort of working back from that. So I think it depends on what type of goals you have, and then matching that up to the appropriate things. And then, sometimes there are projects where you just don't have access to the data. We feel like this is going to make a difference, but I can't say that this sales course makes me a better salesman directly. Relationship building, we think is a positive correlation to sales, but I don't have a direct link, and some of those are fuzzy and more difficult, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I would say, just my advice, and I agree with you. There's no silver bullet here. Is not only look at the objectives, reduce the amount of errors, but like, what other outcomes do you want from that? Like, did just really understand what you're trying to get at? Because as much as you should have like one outcome, like, oh, it should do one thing, because I think that's the only way you can get it focused enough. Like, did you speed them up? Did you make them happier doing it? Like those are really hard to measure, but sometimes that just takes a like, hey, Mike, I'd like to talk. I noticed you filled out your expense report and you went through the training. What was your experience with that? Like, I think the qualitative sometimes is really valuable, because people will tell you stuff that maybe you're not getting from the data, or it's just hard to get from the data. So Laura, I hope that helps. And she actually follows up with a question, Mike. She says, thank you. How do you feel about confidence level surveys? Like, and I'm assuming confidence level is like, do you feel more confident now that you've taken this training? And Laura, correct us if we're wrong.
Yeah, to me, that sounds sort of like a kind of a psychometric kind of question, which not my area of expertise at all. For what little bit I know, like, I think there's some validity to that for the right context. The other thing that you kind of touched on there before that follow-up question, with asking people, I think there is a lot of value in a learning context for just facilitating conversations with people. So it may not be the instructor facilitator, but it's like being at a conference or a workshop. Sometimes the most value you get is the conversation you had at lunch with somebody else in the class. And so I think that's another important thing that we should be doing, is helping people find each other and facilitating conversations.
Yeah, I love that, because I think I've been at conferences with you where we've just sat and chatted, and that felt way more valuable. And not that that sounds terrible. The conference wasn't valuable at all, but yeah, but it's like it's that, I think. So it's the process. You take it in, and then it's giving you a chance to process, right? Like, and we don't often design for that. We don't design for the time to process this information, and we might in a group classroom, like, oh, get together with your peers and 3 people and talk about what you learned. And that's always so contrived, but like, actually getting together with someone and that has mutual interest, and you're not worried about them judging you if you say something dumb. I don't know how to build that. I don't know how to make that happen. But when I've experienced it, I think to what you said, that's the times I've learned probably more than just sitting in an hour long session or, taking an online class. It's like, no, let me tell you about this really cool thing I learned. And then they're like, no, what about this? And you're like, oh yeah, it's just that back and forth. That's when it gets exciting.
Yeah, those are awesome. And there's absolutely an element of serendipity in there, right? Like, crossing paths and all that sort of stuff. But when we're looking at everybody working remotely and the digital platforms, right? Like some of the ideas out of John Stepper's, working out loud kind of concept, just the fact that, I'll go back to my power plant experience, right? Like there's some pretty unique machinery in some of those power plants, and there may be a guy in Virginia who is doing the same job as a guy in Texas, and neither of the two know that they exist, but they can really help each other out a lot and not be solving the same problems over and over just by, oh, hey, John has solved this before. I know he has the answer. Let me call him, right? Like, so just, making visible jobs and roles and what you're working on is another thing that I think that gives a lot of value that people don't often think about.
Well, and it seems like that those are hard things for whether you're HR, L&D, HR maybe a little bit more, but like an L&D department to really, learning development to really be able to facilitate. And like I said, because you don't want to control, like the last thing you want to do is the opposite, as a contrived experience to try to set that up where it fails, because I feel like those are the worst. And maybe that's just me, because my introvert self says, no, thank you. I don't want to talk I'll talk to Mike because I know Mike, but I don't want to talk to anybody new.
But and you're right? Like it can't be contrived, and it may be somewhat beyond the scope. But I think as L&D people, we should make our best attempt to model this type of stuff. So, sharing what you're working on, what's happening in your world, sort of stuff. And I agree. Like I don't want random people in the middle of my day like asking me how to make a PowerPoint. Whatever the question is you get. But I'm pretty confident that if those two equipment operators called each other and like, hey, have you ever had this problem, with the flux capacitor, that conversation will benefit both of them. And I would say 9 times out of 10 that he'd be happy to have that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's different, and it's not. And again, to get back to where we sort of started with that is there's definitely a chance element involved, and we're just trying to sort of tip the odds in our favor as much as we can, I think.
No, I think that's great. And I appreciate this discussion because it helps me remember that when we're designing for learning, as someone who makes some learning and it's a lot of video, which I think is an important element to think about, like what media you're going to use and stuff, like it's thinking about that bigger, broader picture, that learning is not just happening necessarily in a single video. There's always context that surrounds that. I mean, I'm even thinking about like when, we've got a lot of people who make videos for YouTube that are, we interviewed some of them actually in the TechSmith Academy. And even when they're making their tutorials, they're not just making oh, you're going to learn about this. And they're thinking it's still about their audience. They're thinking about the context that it's going to be viewed in. Every home video that I've ever, like home improvement video I've ever watched has a context in mind around like when's someone going to do this task. Your fan stopped working. You're going to fix it, right? Like, or whatever. Right. So it makes total sense. And I think it's a great message as we're thinking about this process of designing for learning. It's not just about the thing you want someone to do. Yeah, absolutely. It's funny, your YouTube comment reminded me, when all of the late night hosts were started to broadcast from their home, right? Like I saw this really fantastic, I can't remember his name now, but a big YouTube guy, and he's critiquing all of these guys filming at home and telling them all the things they're doing wrong. They're like, come on, man, get with the program. You're doing it wrong. It's this kid sitting in his living room. That's really, but it was spot on though. Yeah, absolutely. So Mike, we've talked about that curiosity. We've talked about the, understanding your audience, some other things. at some point when you're designing learning, you got to start to build stuff, right? Like you've done all your upfront work, and then it comes down to design and development. And there's a million different paths someone could go through depending on what they're going to build. But what advice would you give to anyone watching and listening about like where to go with that design and development piece of it? Because I mean, it's so important to you got to make something, like you got to deliver something, whether it's a workshop, a workbook, a handout, a job aid, whatever it might be. And I'm keeping it intentionally broad because I don't want to say like, hey, well, Mike, let's talk about video, but like just how do you think about that part of the process, and what advice do you have for someone that's starting to make a project if they were doing it, say, today?
Yeah, I think that one of the most important things comes down to sort of how can I be the most helpful? How can I be helpful in the most efficient way? Right? Like if I need somebody to do their expense report, what's the least I can do effectively that will help them get the job done the right way? Right? Like if I can do it in 2 minutes, I'm not going to take 5. If I can do it in 5 minutes, I'm not going to take 20. Right? Like it's that. One of the workshops I always ask, what do people wish they could steal from marketers? And one of my favorite answers I've ever gotten is that efficiency of messaging, right? Like it's amazing what a marketer can tell you in a 15-second or 30-second commercial. And like just trying to channel that, like always be helpful and, be snappy about it, right? Like get in, get out and move on with your day. I think that's really the heart of what for me is good learning. Now we've got all these other things surrounding that we talked about, but when you get down to building, right, I think that's a big thing for me.
No, it's interesting because when you said that, the thing I started thinking about is like marketers, particularly pre-internet, right, were forced to be like you had a 15-second spot, or a 30-second spot, or a 60-second spot if you had money. But like they were really forced by those constraints to get really good at that. And I think those lessons get passed on. And the internet's changed things a little bit, but still, like they know they only have so much time. Whereas, and I worry about someone getting the wrong message. I'm not saying go make your training all be 30 seconds long, because I think it's wrong. But to your point of like, let's trim out the fat here. What do you really need to know? Because then if there's something else that extra, like put that in the notes, put that in a different slide deck, put that like that, because that content can exist. But I love this idea of like, let's just trim it down. Like how efficiency of message is such a good idea. How many lessons have you sat through, Mike, that gave you the learning objectives up front as part of the
too many.
And
too many.
There's value.
I'm done.
There's value in those learning objectives, but not necessarily as part of the course, right? Like,
right. Yeah. So I think the other piece that goes with that, right? Like if we're doing these or sort of right-sized pieces, I think there's two factors that kind of help people. Some people are uncomfortable with cutting things too small or too finely, but I think if you make your content so that it can move, that it can be shared, right? Like think about the world's greatest e-learning course that's giving you the meaning of life, and it's locked away in an LMS and nobody can share it, right? Like that has much less value than, hey, I found this and I can 1 or 2 clicks and get it to my colleague or my friend or whatever. So that whole concept of, how can that content move? How can it be shared? Is super important, I think. And then the thing that goes hand in hand with that, with it being able to be shared, is then that gets back to conversations, right? Hey, you're working on something like this. This would be helpful for that. Is this how this works, right? And so by the fact of being able to share it and talk about it easily without having to be in the same room, I think those things all go together to make really valuable stuff.
When you were saying that, one of the things that made me wonder about, and I don't think this is where there's going to answer, but like as an adult, I have to seek out learning that is sometimes related to my job. Sometimes it's like the home stuff or whatever. But I wonder if that's why YouTube is growing in terms of being a search engine about how to, because it is easily shareable, it's easily findable, and of course in a corporate environment, you're gonna have stuff that's gonna be contrived. Like you're gonna have to take compliance training, you're gonna have to take that sexual harassment training or making sure you're not being discriminating or whatever security things. But I wonder if organizations kind of could open up the drawer a little bit to learning and make that if there's a way to do this, and I don't know that there is a good way to do it, but make that learning flow a little bit more from a receiving side, but also a creation side. If that would really open up people's abilities to learn and to understand kind of like and grow, just because I think that's what learning is about, is growing their skills, abilities, capabilities, in lots of different ways.
I think there it is possible. I agree. There are absolutely things that need to be locked down and kept private and all that sort of stuff. I don't think it's as much as maybe all the compliance people probably say. So I think there's opportunity there if you are curious and look for those ways. I think there's also an opportunity. I can tell you, I've seen multiple, any more than one is too many, internal people building something about how to do something in Excel. Well, why are you building that, right? Right. Because there's 100 that are better than whatever you're going to build. Like just grab one and pull it in, like curate that stuff. And that's another thing I think, right? Training people, our budgets, like we never have big budgets to start with. Maybe we may be seeing some increase based on what's happening now. Hopefully, if you still have a job, that's the challenge, right? But like we typically have to meter the way we use our resources, and we have to be smart about it. So don't build an Excel course. Go find something that works and spend your time and hours on more valuable things. And it's just this whole big, reshuffling of the puzzle of what we're doing and how we're doing it and all that sort of stuff that I think there's a lot of opportunities there, especially in the context of, what we're facing now.
Yeah. What a great idea, right? Like that curation is such an important piece that it gets overlooked, because I know, and I'm super guilty of this, is I like to build my stuff. Like I want to be the one that builds it and you get to be the hero, but I'm not an expert in Excel. I couldn't build that course nearly as well. Like one of our guests a couple weeks ago, that's what he does. He makes Excel videos on YouTube and he's really good at it. So
yeah,
makes total sense.
And and there may be some unique, the very unique expense reporting system at TechSmith is a really certain thing you have to do in Excel, and you could do a 2-minute screencast for somebody, right? Like you're not teaching them Excel, you're teaching this unique thing. Yeah. But I'm not going to overproduce stuff that I don't need to overproduce, I think is kind of the point.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mike, I want to go to a couple other questions because we have 2 in the queue and I want to get to it. And this has been an awesome conversation, but let's do this. So first one, think outside the slide.com says, in creating my video content, I have found that writing the accompanying article first has helped me force me to get clear on what I need to teach. Do you have a sequence that you follow? So obviously, great thing, right? Like they're writing the article, so that's the body of the content. So everything that needs to get shared, and then they're going to taking that to use to create their video. Do you have a process that you use?
Yeah, sounds like mine is similar to his. If that's who I think it is, he does very good videos, really good stuff, by the way. So hi, Dave, if that's you. But I typically start with an outline too, right? Like you get an idea, and I think there's some value to me as well of getting your thoughts out. Some people can do this on the fly, and I'm not one of those people. Some people are incredible about, they just ad hoc through it, and it's amazing. But I don't have that skill set, so I've got to get it out on paper and plot. Okay, I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, and I want to. And it's not so much of a full script maybe, but it's talking points, so it sort of stays kind of natural. But yeah, getting things on paper for me are a must. Otherwise, it's just a hot mess. Unless I'm going to go back and do a lot of heavy editing, right? And then in
Right.
which case, right, then the timeline, takes a lot longer. So it's more efficient to me to get it down up front than try to clean it up in the back.
And they say thanks, Mike, and it is who you said it was. So
Okay, awesome.
I think for me, I do a lot of ad hoc stuff just because I'm live every week, and even like with my presentations, like an hour-long presentation I'm going to do, I build out my slides. Like I know what those slides represent. I know what they are. I sometimes have more detailed notes or less detailed notes depending on what that particular slide is. But yeah, I mean, you got to get that stuff out, and I think it's a good way to think of like boxing, kind of putting the frame around what is the knowledge, and then anything that doesn't fit in that box, you can toss it out. You can say, nope, that's outside the bounds of what this box contains. So it makes a lot of sense.
And PowerPoint, if you're working in PowerPoint, like that's what I like to work in the most, because it's almost like index cards, right? Where you can move them around and you can use sections. And so that's to me is a form of outlining. Like I know I want to hit these 3 sections, and then I can drop in details and move them around. And that's a really great a workflow that I like to do.
Yeah, it's amazing what all the things that PowerPoint, it gets a bad name, but it's amazing all the things you can use it for and the ways you can use it. So it's really a great tool if you're not using it for that purpose, even storyboarding, all sorts of things. I'm
a huge fan of PowerPoint. So in the right hands, it's not PowerPoint that's the problem, it's the operators.
Absolutely. Well, let's move on to our next question. And this is Jason Vlad. And Jason says, what does engagement mean to you in an online learning environment?
Oh gosh, it sounds a little broad to me. I think if you have people participating, sort of leaning in, right? Like what we were talking about earlier, like you're giving them the hook, you're showing them the what's in it for me, why I'm here, as opposed to running through the objectives and we're going to do this and we're going to this, like just get right to it. And I think in online things, you can also tell there's some, depending on what platform you're in or what tool you're using, like you get some activity metrics. That's one easy indicator, right? Like, so if you're having a lot of conversations and people are looking at page views or whatever those kind of metrics, those are the easiest probably to look at. And then, then there's sort of a subjective thing of if you're actually in there. And one of the participations, right? Like you can kind of tell, you can sense it, right? Like are people being active and engaging in conversation and stuff like that. So that's probably not a great answer. So I don't know if there's any other like particular slant to that or not.
Well, I can let you know, Jason is a colleague of mine at TechSmith. So.
Okay.
So you didn't say Camtasia Interactive Hotspots quizzing. I mean, it's the wrong answer then, Mike. I'm sorry. I'm kidding. Totally kidding. Go ahead.
From the stuff that I see that you and the rest of, your TechSmithian colleagues, right? Like, I think you guys have a pretty good sense of that stuff. So, you guys might ask yourselves that question because you guys do a lot of really great stuff.
Well, and I think engagement's going to be hard, especially in an asynchronous or non-same time environment, right? Like figuring out what those things are. But I mean, if I had, and no one has unlimited budget, but if I could do things like, get people to do projects and bring things back, like just building in touch points with the instructor or with other teachers, like or with other people that were in the class, those all to me ring as powerful mediums. I mean, I think even a simple fact that Jason was able to ask a question, we were able to answer it in real time. It's a micro engagement. Is it the best engagement? Probably not, but it's something, and I'm sure he probably likes that a lot more than just sitting and listening because he's now part of the show. He's part of what we're doing.
Absolutely, and then I don't know how close you look at that, but we may post this next week. Somebody builds on a question that somebody else had. That that's one of the benefits of doing things openly and online, right? Like it doesn't just happen to happen today; it could happen sometime in the future, and somebody may find some value there, right? And it's not just lost because they weren't here today.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that said, if people do have questions, we do monitor the comments. And if you got comments on Facebook or YouTube or wherever you're watching this, leave a comment. We do respond. I try to respond to those personally, and or text someone from TechSmith. We'll get to you, and we try to answer questions. Well, Mike, we're about at time to wrap up with you. We got a segment we're going to do right after this after we're done with Mike. But Mike, any last parting words of advice or anything you would want to let the audience know about designing for learning that we haven't already talked about?
No, I think just circling back to the very beginning there, like just always try to be curious and don't just go with the status quo. Like look for, ask that what if question. What if we did this, or what if we did something different? And it may not always work out, and you may sometimes fall back to sort of the standard approaches. But I think if you can always consistently ask that question, that over time you're going to find better solutions. And then if you're doing that in conjunction with, right, like doing your best to understand who's on the other end. So who are you going to be speaking to, or who are you helping to work better, whatever the case might be. I think those are two pretty powerful things to operate on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mike, I want to thank you so much for spending time with me today. It's always great to talk to you, first of all. You're such a great person and so knowledgeable. If you guys haven't seen Mike's stuff, we got his website right down below him, mike-taylor.org. You put out so much great stuff, and someday maybe we just have to talk about that process of how you get it all out, because Mike really puts out a lot of stuff, and he's not getting anything out of it, I don't think, just sharing what he's reading, what he's learning. Mike he's one of the gems of the industry, and someone I'm grateful to know and get to chat with on occasion. So Mike, thank you very much.